right, welcome back into the Idea Collision. As always, I'm your host, Andrew Green, and I hope today finds you having a good day. It's sunny here anyway, so it's nice, and got to actually roll down my windows, which is strange for Wisconsin. We are continuing our discussion in truth, and before we get into that, if you're new joining us, I just kind of want to give a background briefly to the podcast that we do here. So for about a half an hour or so, we try to discuss things that are actually worthwhile. So many podcasts, there's so much content out there in different areas that is really, it's time filler, and some of it's, I suppose, interesting, but it doesn't really leave you with anything. It's just kind of a conversation, or it's controversial, and what we try to do here is to be thought-provoking without being necessarily provocative. We want to leave you with something when you're done. And so we kind of look at different ideas or philosophies, history, events, whatever, and look at how they interact with religious themes or spiritual themes. And so we've been discussing truth, which I think is, as I've said, probably the most important thing to lay the groundwork of before you have any type of an intellectual discussion or philosophical discussion to really understand what the ground rules for any discussion are. And we have to begin with truth. And we've seen how we began kind of with the idea of how generations developed to get to where we are today, and to see how those have evolved and influenced society in every aspect of where we're at today, whether it be crime or, even political things and things that you wouldn't necessarily connect with it, with some of the events that have occurred even up to hundreds of years ago. So we want to also show kind of some of the dichotomy of thought that people have, this two ways of thinking. We want to be right. People have this dual nature. We all want to be right. And yet, at the same time, none of us really want to change our minds. None of us want to be forced to change our minds because we're comfortable with, especially the older you are, you kind of have established what you think. And so I want to be right. But if I am wrong on anything, I don't want to confront that. So it really is kind of a contradiction. And so we looked last week at kind of one of the two ways we handle this dichotomy, and that is that a lot of times we just simply avoid it. And we avoid it in several ways, but we can just ignore truth, which is what postmodernism is. It says there's no truth, and so whatever I say, I feel, I don't, I just get to determine what that is, and so I don't really feel like, acknowledging any evidence whatsoever. And so we talked about that a little bit, and then there's an idea that, well, I'm gonna demand that I'm correct, and so I whatever I'm doing, I'm avoiding, and sadly, this comes to a point where, as we do this, what we would realize, and I'll use a silly illustration, but as we do this, it becomes dangerous, becomes destructive, and we'll talk more about that kind of as we wrap up today. But, go back to the podcast where we talked about those decolonizations or deconstructionists, in Cape Town University. If one of them's standing on the top of a building and they want to get over to another building on campus, and so they decide, instead of getting down, off of the roof and going over to the other campus building, they just decide, well, it's a lot straighter. I'll just determine my own physics, and it's a straight line over there, and I'll just walk there from here. Well, they're going to find out. I hate that Isaac Newton. Why did he decide to make gravity? That was very arbitrary of him to do that. And so they're going to walk over, from their building over to another building, and they're going to find out, of course, that they're going to suffer the consequences of ignoring truth and trying to avoid that. So whether we're just trying to make our own truth, or whether we're trying to ignore inconvenient sources of truth, we talked about that as well. it's going to be destructive to us in the long term. If we want to know that we're right, we're going to have to entertain some things that are not convenient for us and consider those. We might decide that those aren't accurate. Just because it's different doesn't mean it's true. Doesn't mean that we're always wrong. But we need to know that we're right, which means we're going to have to entertain some inconvenient things from time to time. And I want to kind of, like I said, we sometimes pull in things that you don't think are connected. And so I want to go back and look, as we're going to begin our second method, which is it's avoidance, because sometimes you cannot get around, opposite thoughts. We try to control those, we try to filter those, but what happens when I can't? I'm confronted with it, and it's right there. What do we do? Well, sometimes if we still don't want to face it, what we'll do is we'll try to manipulate it. We'll try to do what's called rationalization. And I want to talk about the father. Well, he's considered the father of modern psychotherapy. Now, actually, no one quotes Sigmund Freud on anything because he put the psycho in psychotherapy. He did get one thing accidentally right, I think, and we'll talk about that. But mostly he was wrong. And I want to kind of go to something even not directly connected to his psychotherapy. It's indirectly connected, but we call the 80s the era of cocaine. Well, we usually, when we say that, are talking about the 1980s. What we don't know is that it was also true in the 1880s. Those 2 decades, for some reason, 100 years apart, were big. And Sigmund Freud is one of the big reasons why cocaine was a big deal, specifically in Europe, and it started to get into the United States. That, among some other things that were happening, was the cause, kind of, for the Food and Drug Administration's creation to regulate. So there's some crazy things going on, but he wrote a article in 1884. He was massively addicted to cocaine his whole life. He wrote a article called Über Coca, and it was the how great cocaine was, and that's basically his article. He had a close friend who was also an author and also a doctor who put this, I guess, the results of this profound study in his book and in one of his novels, and developed a character with this tendency, if you will, in Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, of course, who wrote the very popular Sherlock Holmes at the time, had Sherlock Holmes as kind of a frequent user of cocaine. It even found its way into beverages. I mean, that's its namesake beverage is Coca-Cola, coca from cocaine, which kind of made it incredibly addictive. Eventually, they realized that this was very harmful. So one of the things that happened is all these scientific journals and these popular societal avenues of promoting it made this become an epidemic in the 1880s. Addicted, it might still be. This might be still the reason for cocaine's popularity up till recently. I mean, I know cocaine has declined as some of the cheaper, harder drugs have come in like meth and some of those, but this has something to do with rationalization, because this almost killed his reputation, Sigmund Freud's. And so it was around this time that he was doing work in psychotherapy and counseling and various things like that, and he was having a significant number of women come and talk about things in their life and things in their past. And I can't get too much into detail because this is kind of family friendly. Being as how it's family friendly, I can't tell you the most psycho things that Sigmund Freud ever said they are. You can look them up on yourself if you've never heard them yourself. They're horrible. But he was coming across a lot of data, and this data was saying that women were reporting different types of abuse as children at the hands of relatives specifically, and he was uncovering something which we know the statistics today. They're not really that different. They might have been even worse back then, but because of less media coverage, because of less awareness of it. But it was epidemic, and he was discovering this epidemic, and so he was confronted with an unpleasant choice. Now, people talk about this today, but it was definitely true then, talking about a society that is male-dominated. And so he was realizing, what happens if I publish an article, given his reputation, given his one mistake in the past that he was sort of starting to get over in the late 1880s and into the 1890s. What if I publish an article saying, here's all these men that are behaving very badly and abusing children? He knew that wasn't going to fly. So what he did was he published another article, and he had a whole theory surrounding this that was popular in psychotherapy until, relatively recent in history. And what he said was that the girls hadn't actually suffered this. Now, he said he had to come up with a theory because there was so much data. Obviously, we know our mind is stretched to its limits, trying to say that this many people were making it up simultaneously. That type of phenomenon doesn't exist statistically. So he looked for a reason. He tried to come up with a psychological reason why all these women would be making it up. And he came up with a theory. It's called projection. And what he said was, they actually, it didn't happen, but they wanted it to happen. It was their subconscious wanted this to happen, and that's why they created it. Well, obviously you can understand the horrific nature of what this did to Europe. But it did a number of things. First of all, it delegitimized the girls and the women who were victims, right? And so the adult victims are going to have to continue to live in that situation with that grief and not able to heal, not able to truly counsel, because their counselors are now all men are all going to tell them, oh, you just imagined it, and that's not going to assist anybody getting better. It then secondarily gave men cover, or at least some men who were doing this, to continue doing that, because no one is going to assume that it's true, because the great Dr. Sigmund Freud said it's not true, and everybody else is picking up on this. So they're excused. No one's going to investigate. They can keep creating another generation of victims. Right? So it's just going to be a self-cycling thing. So it was a horrible thing that he did. Well, what was the root cause of this? Why did this come out? It didn't come out from an actual objective view of the information. Right? Anybody with any sense in their head would have looked at the information and come to the correct view, is that these women, or at least the majority of them, were telling the truth. But this was a rationalization. He had a vested interest in not telling the truth, and that was to keep his career. He was not going to survive a second, scandalous position. So he comes up. One of the things that he came up with was the idea of self-defense mechanism, which is actually true. He sort of stumbled across that idea that we do things, whether consciously or subconsciously, to protect ourselves. And he's actually the perfect example of it, whether he knew it or not, that his theories were coming from the the motivation of self-preservation. He was trying to preserve his career, trying to preserve his reputation, and so he came up with this rationalization as a self-defense mechanism. And so he reinterpreted the data to fit what he wanted. He couldn't avoid it, in other words. He couldn't just say, I didn't do these interviews. He's got the data. He's written it down. It's there. It's in his notebooks. But he's got to do something to avoid the conclusion that he doesn't like. So he can't avoid it. He rationalizes it. So I think it's important to know why we are motivated. We'll get to some of those motivations in just a second. When we talk about some of the motivations that people have for rationalization or just for life philosophies, the life philosophies of postmodernism and modernism are, if it feels good, do it. Right? Do what is right for you. Live your truth. All these sayings. Follow your heart. And that's a big one. Follow your heart. And what this says is that my emotions are the thing that should set the agenda. Well, Jeremiah, the prophet in the Bible, probably almost 3,000 years ago, made this statement. He said, the heart is deceitful more than anything else, and no one can understand it. It is a tricky bugger. And so every philosophy we have today says, no, you should really trust your heart to make decisions for you and determine the direction. Now, we have a mind, and we have a part of us that is emotional, and they're both valuable. They both do things. They're both an important part of us. But what happens then is in postmodernism, what happens is that especially with rationalization, the heart or the feelings, the emotions become the center for our direction and for decision making and determining truth, what I want to be true. We still have a mind. We have to figure out how to utilize the mind. So the heart makes the mind the slave, and it has to come up with an answer, right? It has to come up with an answer to explain why the heart's right. And it puts things totally backwards. Our mind was designed to be the thing that gives us direction and process information. And then the heart, the motivation, it becomes the seat of motivation, the encouragement, the energy to do and perform those decisions that are made with the mind. That's the way we're supposed to operate. But we don't. We operate completely backwards when we are influenced, that is, by postmodernism or relativism, the subjective way of thinking, where we deny that truth exists, or at least some truth. And so I want to look at some specific motivations. These are just a handful. There's many more, and they cross over. But sometimes we minimize, or I should say rationalize, because we're trying to minimize disappointment. You'll see this. I used to do this. I used to be an avid sports follower. I'm not nearly so much. In fact, almost very, very little at all. But I would do this thing where I didn't want the disappointment of my team letting me down. And you get all amped up for a game or whatever. And so I would convince myself that the team was going to lose. And then they're probably not that good or whatever. I would minimize a possible disappointment. And then if they won, I would feel pleasantly surprised. But then I went through all this torture ahead of time, that I put myself through. But I want it to end on an up note. Well, it's who cares if you're doing this in sports, but potential outcomes when we're wanting to accomplish things, we minimize our disappointment, and we maybe set our standards low as a result of this. So this is I want you to look at how destructive these thought processes are. These rationalizations, they seem logical, they seem okay. They seem like they won't do anything, but they are destructive long term, and for a number of reasons. The second one that I want to look at is to to process discomfort we have that comes from failure. I need to justify my failure. I've tried to accomplish something. It didn't work. Now, I can do a lot of things. I can do this by blaming other people. It's their fault. This didn't happen, or some unexplainable cause. Something intervened. Circumstances were against me. Whatever the case may be, I can I can come up with any number of rationalizations why I failed. But what happens, it was a conspiracy theory or whatever. But it will never be because I was wrong. It's never because my attempt was based on an idea that was incorrect, or because of some flaw that I had that I wasn't able to accomplish that. I want to get rid of that. I can't avoid the fact that it failed, but so I have to come up with an explanation, and so I rationalize it away. Maybe I want to avoid, some discomfort from being wrong. I'm wrong, and I can't. You get a 40 on a test. Well, it's the teacher's fault, or she should have prepared me. The book was the book didn't explain it well. I can come up with that would be like you're in college, and those are the types of answers. But just being wrong in general, you've been under the impression of something, and you're confronted with the fact that you're not correct about something. And a lot of what we'll do is we engage here in something we're going to talk more specifically about probably next week and the week after. But there's things called logical fallacies. You might be familiar with them, but I want to familiarize you with what all a logical fallacy means. It's logic that is incorrect. It's a bad argument. It doesn't really support what we're trying to get to, but it sounds like it does. And they're very sneaky. They're very tricky. So we use bad logic to try to get away from confronting the fact that we're incorrect. Another one is when we want to avoid what is obviously a behavior modification that we need to make. I learned something. I'm confronted with information. It tells me I'm going to have to change a behavior. It's not just that I'm going to have to acknowledge that I'm incorrect, but I'm going to have to acknowledge that I need to do something based with this information. And that's uncomfortable. And so I'll say things like maybe, well, everybody's doing it, right? That's a rationalization. I don't have to change because everybody else is doing it. Or I could be worse. I could be that person. I'll compare to something worse. It's actually helping that person. This behavior is actually helping that person in the long run, if you think about it, because they're gonna become a better person for this. So I can continue my bad behavior because it's beneficial to somebody else. Right? We come up with all sorts of rationalizations. There's an endless supply of them because we are good at rationalizing. Just it comes natural to us. And so that helps me avoid the work of changing my behavior. I might want to give a reason for just a negative circumstance, something that's happened to me. And so some of these previous ones will kind of come back in. It's a conspiracy theory. It's something happened. It's other people did it. But sometimes religious people will engage in this too, and they engage in spiritual versions of this, and they'll say things like, well, I really don't deserve this anyway. And it could be a non-Christian that says this. It doesn't make a difference. I don't deserve it. It's really essentially a person with low self-esteem. But sometimes that gets Christianized by thinking, that this is humility. It's just called false humility. And we feel like we're being spiritual, but it's not really. Or, it was for the best. For me, I'm going to suffer. But God was doing this that's why I'm in a negative circumstance. Now, it might be. I don't know. But we instantly sometimes jump to this logic. It was God's will, and we come up with some explanation for why God has done this to me. I might rationalize again by a comparison instead of I'm better than other people. Well, other people have it worse than me. So I guess I really don't have the right to feel bad about this negative circumstance that I live in. Again, this is not necessarily about me being bad, but just a bad situation that I live in. It might be poverty that's beyond my control or whatever. Abuse that we talked about. It's my fault or something. And those all come from negative self-esteem. So these are slightly different. We have disillusionment sometimes with other people. You've had a hero, and if you've had a hero and you've watched them enough, you've seen them do something stupid, or you've seen them do something out of character, and that we don't want to feel that. We like our heroes to be perfect, and so when a hero fails, or a loved one, a relative, a parent, whatever, has someone we look up to, a teacher, whatever, when they have flaws that are visible, or we see them incorrect in some way, we will rationalize on their behalf. Well, it's not their fault, or maybe I was the one that caused them to have this failure, or there's some reason why they're really actually are perfect, and just this one situation. We try to make excuses, and it sounds good because it sounds like I'm being magnanimous for that person. But really, actually, what it is it is, in a weird way, it's self-serving. Because why am I doing that? Because they're my hero, and I don't want my hero to be imperfect. It's because they're connected to me, and that might have implications on the type of person that I would admire. And I would only admire a good person, so they must be good. There must be some reason why this flaw, showed itself. And then another self-worth, where I would excuse others when they hurt me. Why did this person abuse me? Why did this person do something specifically to me? Well, it was my fault, and we see this a lot, especially when people are really young and stuff. It's something. Why did my parents get a divorce? I must have done something. That's a common one, and it might be older. I might do this to try to avoid a conflict that would put me in a worse situation. So I want to avoid a divorce, so I won't say what I feel or what I'm suffering. I want to avoid conflict, and I don't want them to leave for whatever reason. So again, it is sort of self-serving, but it comes from a negative self-esteem that we're trying to protect ourselves. These self-defense mechanisms, they're all self-defense mechanisms, and they are destructive in their thoughts. And here's why. There's a number of reasons. The value of rationalization, right? The values that rationalization uses, that's where the danger is, because it sets up a number of things. First of all, they're always short-term versus long-term. Rationalizations are almost, I would say they're almost always short-term. I'm going to get in trouble, I better do this thing. Whatever the rationalization for it, I need to do this. I don't think about the long-term good for myself even. Even if I was going to be self-serving, if I thought about the long-term good, I might make a better decision. But short-term solutions are almost always Band-Aid solutions, and they almost always end up with deception of other people, not just myself. Another one is the protection versus improvement. Self-defense is there to protect me from punishment. Maybe I don't want to get in trouble, or whatever harm I'm trying to avoid, right? And when I do that, what I'm focusing on is the external impact of this unpleasant situation, the circumstance, whereas improvement focuses on the inner person that is me, and I'm going to benefit, again, long term, because improvement is always a time thing. And so protection versus improvement is always where rationalization steps in, and it causes long-term damage and internal damage. It's always, or almost always, the easy versus difficult. Right? Rationalization is there to make things easier for me. manipulating facts is easy. You just have to, you have to know how to be deceptive to yourself. And we're good at it. We're like born into it. But challenging your biases, and not just challenging your biases, but working on those internal flaws and being honest about them, that is hard work. It's emotional hard work. It's physical hard work sometimes. It's spiritual hard work. It's just hard. And so rationalization tries to avoid those things. And the last one that there's probably a lot more. And a trained therapist could give you a lot more. I am not a trained therapist. Just a lot of these are just things that I've, over 50 years of my life I've encountered and seen, and not just in other people, but in myself. But self-seeking versus the community. And when I say community, I don't mean your neighborhood. That could mean that. Rationalization always has one beneficiary, myself. That's who I'm trying to benefit when I rationalize. And again, even those times where we think we're trying to do this on behalf of other people, what we saw is that really I'm kind of at the center of it. And it feels like I'm being generous to other people, but really it's to protect myself. The community can be a lot of things. It could be the workplace. It could be your school. The community could be your church. The community could actually be your neighborhood. It could be society as a whole. Whatever group that you find yourselves in, a small group of friends whatever it is, rationalization is always going to benefit you to the detriment of that group that you find yourself in this situation where you want to rationalize. Well, it was okay for me to do this thing at work. Why? Well, guess what? Other people suffered. Other people had to pick up the slack, or whatever the thing was. Your friends had to. Well, it was okay for me to do this thing with my friends. We were out, whatever. Again, they're going to have to do something to carry the load for whatever it was that you didn't want to do. And so it is destructive to other people, and it is destructive to myself, because long term I only reinforce those bad habits. So I want you to. I hope I don't want to leave you in a negative place. Maybe this one kind of feels a little bit negative, but there are ways to avoid those, and honesty, self-honesty, and finding a person that helps you through honesty and will be there not to judge you, but to help you. Finding those people, finding those relationships that foster self-honesty and say, you know what, these are the hardcore facts, and they're not pleasant sometimes, but they're going to be, 5, 4, 3 months ahead, a couple of weeks ahead. These will be changes, and you look back and you go, wow, things are already starting to improve. It feels like a long time. It feels like a lot of work. It is work. But that is the process of making ourselves better people, and not trying to figure out the heart, because the heart is so deceptive. But charting our path with our mind, and letting our heart occupy its natural place, which is to motivate us to make those changes. So again, I always say, check our links, whichever way you're listening or watching. There are links in the description to point you to more resources. Specifically, if you have some of these issues that we talked about, there are ways to deal with those. If you're not a part of a church, I always suggest that people become a part of a church, and where you will find people who are genuinely interested in you. So I hope you have a really good week. I hope this information benefits you.